I'm Andrew Wise. This is a summary of a workshop about Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, given in the series about music and literature for the Royal Conservatory, Antwerp. Wagner is one of the most influential figures in the history of music, theatre and philosophy. Some people love him, others hate him. It's impossible for anyone to ignore him. To call him only a composer is to do him a disservice, for he was much more than that. His operas are intense psychological dramas based on mythological characters. They are long, they are sophisticated. There is not one note in them that has any other purpose than the single direct purpose of giving musical expression to drama. Here are the subjects we'll be dealing with in this tutorial, quite a lot, as you can see. So let's get started. There are only 10 titles which we need to bother about, and these are listed here. Tristan is a product of his maturity, written, as you can see, when he was in his mid-40s. It's interesting to notice that there was a pause of 14 years during the composition of his most famous work, Der Ring des Nibelungen, and that Tristan and Meistersinger were both written during this pause. Lots of books and dissertations have been written about why. This is something to consider if you're interested in this kind of thing, but not particularly relevant now. All you need to know is that Tristan represents the most complete development of his style of intense, psychologically dramatic music. We can't ignore Wagner's politics, and shouldn't even want to, because it's part of who he was and part of his achievement as an artist. He was a revolutionary after all. If you open a newspaper here in Flanders and the name Wagner comes up, then they always mention that he was Hitler's favorite composer. This may or may not be true. I wonder what Hitler's favorite brand of coffee was, or tea, or wine, or whether he preferred raspberry jam to strawberry, and thus, when jam is discussed in the newspaper, whether Hitler's favorite brand would be mentioned. But I suppose politics is different. And he was political, that's for sure. German nationalism went out of fashion in 1945, for reasons we all know. But German nationalism was very much in fashion from the second half of the 19th century. Wagner dreamt of a united country, sharing a common German culture, and gave voice to this dream in Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, an opera which celebrates the victory of the youthful, natural, inspired, spontaneous musician over the dry-as-dust academic. The opera celebrates a lot of other things too, but let's leave it at that for now. Wagner was political. He gave up a good job as conductor of the opera house in Dresden to demonstrate on the barricades in favour of the revolutions of 1848. He had to run for his life and leave the city to escape arrest and long imprisonment. He was a political revolutionary. Rheingold's, the first of the Ring operas, you can interpret as a political allegory about capitalism if you want to. You wouldn't be the first. The Irish playwright and polemicist George Bernard Shaw wrote a thought-provoking and amusing book about the subject called The Perfect Wagnerite, which I recommend. It's short, it's controversial, it's beautifully written, it has no footnotes. You can see why one might like it. Hitler liked Wagner. He also liked Bayreuth, where Wagner had a theatre built to his own specifications. It's an amazing theatre with a hidden orchestra pit and perfect acoustics for operas with a large orchestra. You're allowed to like it, even if Hitler also did. That doesn't make you a Nazi. You're allowed to like raspberry jam too. The last item in the list is awkward to like if you're a lover of Wagner, which you've probably guessed I am. Wagner was an anti-Semitic and wrote a book to prove it called Judaism in Music, Das Judentum in der Musik. He thought Mendelssohn a facile note spinner, and he envied Meyerbeer his success at the Paris Opera. They were both Jewish and they were both composers, very fine composers too. He ought not to have written it, but he did all the same. I wish he hadn't. It's a blemish on his achievement. I won't try and defend him. But I would like to mention the name of Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century. Zionists wanted to found a national home for the Jewish people in the country we now call Israel. They were in the end successful, as we know, though they might not have been without the appalling suffering Jews had to endure during the Second World War. Anyway, Herzl admired Wagner in spite of das Judentum in der Musik. So maybe this fact places his anti-Semitism in some kind of perspective. Back to the influential composer Richard Wagner and something slightly less serious. Yes, that cheese you know and love was inspired by Die Walküre, the second of Wagner's Ring operas. No wonder you feel so energetic after a breakfast with that on your plate. And so finally we get to Tristan und Isolde. It's a love story. Wagner knew about love. Here are the important women in his life. First, the actress Minna Plana. They had a stormy and not very successful relationship and split up quite quickly when Wagner left Dresden. In Switzerland, he met a rich banker called Otto Wesendonck, who supported him financially while he was in exile as a hunted political dissenter. Wagner fell in love with Otto's wife Mathilde, and it was at this period in his life that he started composing Tristan und Isolde. The story of Tristan is, as we shall see, full of conflict, guilt, self-loathing, and inner torment, as well as ecstasy and passion. That's not hard to understand. Wagner's last and perhaps greatest love was for Cosima, daughter of the composer Franz Liszt. She was married to the great pianist Hans von Bülow when he got to know her. She left von Bülow for Wagner and remained devoted to him for the rest of her life, which, by the way, lasted long after Wagner's death in 1883. Where did Wagner get his story? Not from a librettist or from an existing play. Wagner wrote all his opera texts himself. The story, in fact, originates from an array of Celtic medieval legends. Wagner read the version by Gottfried von Strassburg, but it's worth knowing that various versions of the story were to be found all over the place. The French 19th century medievalist Joseph Bédier compiled the various versions into one anecdotal narrative and called the book Le Roman de Tristan et Isolde. It's fun to read and throws an unusual light on Wagner's story, because many of Bédier's anecdotes are more comic than tragic. Donizetti writes about a love potion too in L'Elisée d'Amore, and there's nothing tragic about that. As a hero of medieval chivalry, Tristan belongs to the history of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, as does Parsifal. Wagner wrote an opera about him too. Wagner limits himself to the tale of the love potion and its tragic consequences. Wagner's hero finds himself in the grip of guilt and retribution caused by events which happened in the past. Once he and Isolde have drunk the potion, Tristan submits to his fate, first to love and then to die, as if he has no choice in the matter, which perhaps indeed he does not. In his interpretation of the story, Wagner was influenced by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. The geography. The story takes place in a corner of Europe whose locations seem to us far removed from each other. However, if you do all your travelling by boat, then the Scilly Isles, Brittany, Cornwall and Southern Ireland aren't so far apart after all. Tristan sails from Cornwall to Ireland to fetch Isolde to be married to King Mark, whose service he is in. They return by boat to Cornwall, arriving at the end of Act 1. Act 2 takes place in Cornwall, Act 3 in Brittany. And the Scilly Isles? That's where Tristan originally comes from. Here's the story of Act 1 in a nutshell. It all makes more sense if you know what happens before the opera starts, but that's too much to explain now. Brangäne is Isolde's friend and servant, a kind of lady-in-waiting if you like. She has a number of potions with her, a medicine chest as it were, put together by Isolde's mother, who must have been a real expert. Corvenal is to Tristan as Brangäne is to Isolde. They all meet on deck. Isolde would rather die than be married to King Mark in Cornwall, and resolves to do so, with the help of her mother's death potion. She wants to take Tristan with her because he betrayed her, and she wants revenge. Brangæna swaps the potions, and they fall in love instead. Act 1 ended as Tristan's boat arrived in Cornwall. As Act 2 begins, Isolde is already married to King Mark. The eternal conflict of passion and duty holds both her and Tristan in its thrall, and they grasp any opportunity to be together. The beginning of this act is one long build-up of tension, up to Tristan's entrance, from where it evolves into a languorous love duet, interrupted only by Brangæna's warnings that Mark's hunting party is on its way home. He arrives. Is it really unexpected, or do they want to be caught? Any relief from the constant longing, Sehnsucht, would, maybe, be welcome, even death. Melot is one of the knights in King Mark's service. Well, the rest you can read as well as I. The third act is basically Tristan's act, even though it closes with the most famous piece in the whole opera, namely Isolde's Liebestod. Tristan sings 3 long, extremely strenuous, philosophical, mournful, emotional monologues, investigating the nature of love, of night, of light, of guilt, of renunciation, of the equivalence of love and death. This sounds a little difficult and cerebral, but it's not. The emotional impact of the first half hour of Act 3 is overwhelming and doesn't need to be rationalized to be understood. The shepherd's plaintive call on the cor anglais sounds like exotic folk music until Wagner uses it as a basis for the enormous symphonic structures which evolve in the course of the monologues. You don't need to analyze this or understand it harmonically, just experience it. The cor anglais changes from mournful to joyous as Isolde finally arrives. You might expect a glorious reunion and a happy ending, but that would be the Disney version. Instead, the equivalence of love and death becomes reality, and the two lovers both die ecstatically. Brangæna had 2 potions in Act 1. They turn out to be the same. The music of Tristan und Isolde exhausts all superlatives. It's hard to think of an achievement more original than Wagner's achievement in writing this score. The bullet points listed here are some of the key words to think about as you listen to the following extracts. Durchkomponiert means through composed, which means continuous evolution of the music, which is not divided into formal recitatives and arias, which we're used to in opera from Handel to Rossini. First, the famous Tristan chord, which you see here in front of you. This short passage, which opens the opera and recurs when the lovers drink the love potion, forms the basis of a good deal of the opera. It has been analyzed hundreds of times. You might find combinations of these notes in J.S. Bach, but it's not about the notes themselves. It's about their constant repetition, transposition, transformation, and the fact that they never resolve until the end of Act 3. Please listen to the extract from Act 2, which is about to start. The musical cells listed are repeated over and over again in this build-up to Tristan's entrance. The first, Isolde's impatience, speaks for itself. She's impatient for her lover to arrive. The summons is like a call to him to please hurry up. The other 2 also speak for themselves. Listen, enjoy, and notice how the cells repeat and repeat as the tension builds up to Tristan's ecstatic arrival. We've heard the beginning of Act 3 already. Here it is again. Notice how the rising four notes compare to the rising four notes of the opening of the opera. To close, here's the text of the poem written by Wagner's real-life lover, Mathilde Wesendonck, the wife of the banker who sponsored him while he lived in Switzerland. The poem is called Im Treibhaus, a greenhouse imagined by Mathilde as full of exotic plants. The poem's atmosphere is full of longing to escape the world of reality, to inhabit the world of imagination. Our home is not here, she writes. The recording you're hearing is sung by Jesse Norman. In the music, you will probably recognize the themes from the beginning of Wagner's prelude to Act 3 of Tristan und Isolde, for which his setting of Mathilde's words can be called a study. Thank you for listening to this presentation. See you again soon.